Welcome back to our Western Front World War I presentation. We ended on this slide from our previous video with the picture of the trenches. Okay, and to continue on, what all the trenches had. This is on your trench warfare notes. Barbed wire. We saw the barbed wire that was in front of the trenches right here. Okay, the barbed wire protected the front of the trenches, placed far enough to keep the enemy from approaching, but close enough to lob grenades at them. So this would protect the soldiers, particularly at night, so the enemy couldn't run right into their trenches. The barbed wire would be there where they would have to try to cut through it, and they would put cans and different noisy objects on the barbed wire so they could hear anybody trying to cut through the trenches. Another place, this was between the trenches, was called no man's land, okay, between the two sides of the trenches. The trenches depended where they were in the war, but usually about 200 to 300 yards away from each other. So that area between the two trenches was known as no man's land. And it was the term to describe the ground between the two opposing trenches. And it was called no man's land because nobody wanted to be there. You're out exposed to gunfire, to artillery, to all the dangers of war. And then you constantly had artillery from the opposing side, shelling you with artillery in your trenches. And artillery accounted for as many as 7 out of every 10 casualties during the war. Before a battle would take place, each side would shoot artillery at the opposing side for a week at a time, and it would last 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for weeks before big battles. Now, if you can imagine these men living in these trenches, you ate, did all of your business, stayed in the trenches. The trenches were not a fun place to be. They're wet. You're digging into the ground, so all the water, everything is coming into the trenches because that's the low point in the ground. Besides just the dirty, muddy conditions, smelly conditions of the trenches, there is also dysentery. Okay, dysentery is a disease involving the inflammation of the large intestine, causing pains and diarrhea. And this, almost every soldier had some type of dysentery throughout the war because of the poor sanitary conditions. The trenches were not real clean. Rats. There was a ton of rats that lived among the soldiers in World War I in the trenches. Because they were dirty, because they were dead, decaying bodies, this drew rats. So rats literally were running amongst the soldiers daily. Lice. Okay, soldiers suffered from lice. Lice would leave blotchy red bite marks all over the body and would cause a disease called trench fever. So as you can see, the trenches were not only not fun because of being in a war and being shot at, but the conditions and the poor sanitary conditions that were in the trenches led to life being very miserable. Okay, I believe you have a video now on fast facts of World War I, so watch that video and write down 3 ideas. Okay, we are now on to the new weapons, why they dug the trenches. Okay, the 5 most important new weapons that came out of World War I were machine guns, poison gas, airplanes, submarines, and tanks. Those were the 5 new weapons. Machine guns were first introduced right before World War I had started, and they are the reason why trenches were dug. Poison gas was used during the war as a way to try to get the troops out from the trenches because the gas is heavier than the air, so you would shoot the poison gas in artillery shells and it would leak down into the trenches. One of the most popular was called mustard gas, and it burned the lungs of the soldiers. But you had to be careful with poison gas, because if you shot the gas at the enemy and the winds changed direction, you might gas your own soldiers, because remember, the trenches were not that all far away from each other, only about 250 yards. Airplanes were first used in World War I. Submarines, another new weapon that the Germans introduced and used to destroy shipping and bringing materials to Europe. And then the British developed the first tanks. The first tanks were supposed to break through the trench lines and get to the other side. But the problem with the tanks were that they were very prone to mechanical breakdown. So they broke down easily, and they only went about 4 miles per hour. So the enemy also had plenty of time to see the tanks coming and aim the artillery at them to try to destroy them. So on your note sheet, I would like for you to rank the weapons of World War I in order of importance and write a sentence to justify why you chose which would be the most destructive weapon of World War I. All right. Some of the major battles: the Battle of the Marne, that's where the French were stopping the Germans in the Schlieffen Plan. 2 battles later on in the war, Verdun and Somme, 2 of the most famous battles of World War I. Verdun was fought between February and December 1916. Almost 300,000 were killed with no side gaining any ground. So 300,000 soldiers killed, and not anybody gaining any more territory. Then the Battle of the Somme from July to November of 1916 took place just south of the Battle of Verdun. The Allies, the French and the British, were able to gain about 6 miles, but at the cost of almost 1 million soldiers killed in the Battle of the Somme. So the casualties of World War I. 10 million soldiers died during the war. Along with 10 million soldiers, another 7 million civilians died as well. 2 million people died from disease, and 6 million went missing and presumed dead. So those were people that they could never find. Either you got hit by an artillery shell directly and there was nothing left of you. Sometimes you were just buried in the trenches. Different things happening to the people. All right, so you did the quick write. Make sure you answer your essential question. And that is it for our notes on the Western Front and the Schlieffen Plan.